The scripture reading today will be taken from various texts. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt of love to one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, and it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails.
There are many sad stories in the Bible, and King David recounts one of the saddest in Psalm 41, verse 9. He writes, "Even my closest friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." So who was this friend that betrayed David's love and trust? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 15, we have the person mentioned. It's none other than David's own son, Absalom. You see, Absalom had tried to steal his father's kingdom from under the king's feet. And as a result, David fled Jerusalem under the cover of night. And shortly after, Absalom enters that great city of Jerusalem. He rides into town like a conquering hero. But when the rebellion ends, David's loyal soldiers discover Absalom hanging by his hair in a tree. They go up to him and they pierce his body with 3 arrows. Absalom has died. When you read these events, when you look at this event, it's very difficult to know which hurt David more. Was it the actual death of his son, or was it the betrayal of his son? And if you've ever suffered the daggers of disappointment from someone you loved or trusted, you can very much sympathize with David. Brothers and sisters, the pain of this type of betrayal is both deep and real. This kind of betrayal tests the fibre of any relationship. And though few honestly expect it, when personal shortcomings come, they test all of our loving relationships. And don't we find this truth throughout the scriptures? What did Noah think about his promiscuous daughters? What about Esau and how he swindled his own brother? Leah lived with a husband who loved another woman. And John Mark abandoned Paul on his first missionary trip. The prophet Hosea struggled with a wife who continually committed adultery. And then Jesus himself, betrayed by one of his closest followers. Usually, for those of us who are married or have had family, usually the birth of a child fills our lives with a very special joy. We grow with them. We watch them learn to walk and talk and play. And as they grow, our love deepens and our joy grows. Remember when your child first went to school, or they bring home that first report card from school, and we beam with pride and with excitement at how well they're doing. But then sometimes, over a period of time, things can go bad. Maybe the report card isn't as good as what you expected. Their grades have dropped. Maybe over time the child becomes a little distant and removed. Maybe you get a little concerned when he or she begins to hang out with friends of questionable character. And maybe, unfortunately for some, before long, that child is openly rebelling against your authority. So how does love behave when a spouse or a child or a best friend dabbles in some form of immoral or destructive behaviour? Well, Paul reminds us here that in such circumstances, love remains true. It remains tough. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 6, Paul writes these words: "Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth." And in writing these words, Paul recognizes several facts about loving relationships. 3 truths for us this morning. The first truth is this: that love will face trials. The truth and reality is this: that our sin impacts our relationships. Think of that verse in Romans chapter 14, verse 7. None of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. There are times when we try to convince ourselves that our behaviour doesn't impact anyone but ourselves. But Paul indicates here that one's personal or moral failures impact others, or one's relationship to other people. Think, for example, of the alcoholic, the gambler, the drug addict, the abuser, or the thief, and how others are affected by relationships with them. Love will face trials. And so this text indicates for us that love and evil are incompatible. There are 3 key words in this verse. There is the word rejoice. And that comes from the same root as joy. And it implies that in a relationship, to rejoice is a shared joy. There's the word evil. And this word literally means that one is in the condition of not being right. And then there is the word truth. And this word refers to that which is right or correct. And so Paul is saying here and reminding these young Christians that love does not rejoice with. Love does not derive any joy from some person who is doing wrong. In fact, evil harms that shared joy of relationship. Love and evil are incompatible. And then it's a reminder to us, isn't it, that Satan will use any vice to disrupt loving relationships. You see, Satan cringes at the sight of love. And that's why he goes around sowing evil any way that he can. The Apostle Peter tells us that in the last days, the devil will disrupt loving relationships. He'll try and introduce into those relationships false beliefs, destructive words, immoral behavior. And so the Apostle Peter writes in 2 Peter chapter 2, but there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping. Every form of evil possesses an intrinsic, harmful consequence and snares. And brothers and sisters, this is also a reminder to us that as followers of Jesus, we are involved in a spiritual battle. We are involved in spiritual warfare, and we need to be on guard. So Peter writes elsewhere in 1 Peter 5 verse 8, "Be alert and of a sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring fire, looking for someone to devour." And the Apostle Paul reminds us, doesn't he, in that great chapter in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, "Put on the full armour of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one." We are reminded that love faces trials. The second truth is found here, that love must remain tough. So what do? You love someone. They fall prey to temptation. What should you do? How do you respond to them? Do you just go out and ignore their sin? Or do you try and defend their failure? How should we respond to other people's failure in this regard? Well, in the first place, it's most important that we remember to walk humbly. The advice of Jesus to the Pharisees should guide us where in John chapter 8, remember the story of the woman having been caught in adultery is brought before the public. The religious leaders are standing around waiting to see what Jesus will do or say. And in John chapter 8, verse 7, Jesus reminds the Pharisees with this quote, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." So we want to walk humbly. With Jesus' words in mind, we must also realize here that Paul tells us that love must show a stiff upper lip. We need to have at times a granite backbone, because love at times needs to be tough. And it needs to be tough enough to call sin by its proper name. In other words, we need to be honest. In our communities and in our society today, our culture prefers to dismiss all responsibility for moral failure. It seems that we've even tried to anaesthetize our conscience. And so we rename, we recategorize our failures. So today, when you pick up the newspaper, we read about people who have chemical dependencies, or they've been deprived by touch, or they have mental health difficulties, or anger is described as road rage. One wonders if we suffered from all those syndromes 100 years ago. And perhaps we need to learn from Alcoholics Anonymous. They recognise that for an alcoholic to recover, he or she must first admit that they're alcoholic. So you attend an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. You sit in a small group. The first thing you might say is this: "Hi, I'm Richard, and I'm an alcoholic." They rejoice in that truth. They admit who they are. So Paul reminds us here, we need to call sin by its proper name. We need to be upfront. We need to be honest. And then we need to condemn sin for what it does. Paul writes here that evil or unrighteousness is wrong. And in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul draws our attention to the fact that members of the church knew of a case where a man is living and sleeping with his mother-in-law. Paul grieves the problem. But it seems to me that what he states in 1 Corinthians 5 is that he's even more disappointed that the members of the congregation in Corinth, none of them were willing to stand up to declare what the sin was. They refused to call the behaviour wrong. And so this man continues to live with this woman in their midst. Brothers and sisters, in love, with God's love, in Christian love, we need to state to those that we care about that to pursue destructive lifestyles is wrong. That if they continue in that path, they will hurt not only themselves, but also others in relationship with them. Call sin by its proper name, condemn sin for what it is or what it does, and then confront sin before it destroys. You see, true biblical love will never support or enable a destructive lifestyle. Just think about applying this truth to peer relationships. Think a little about teenagers, for example, and how often teenagers can face a moral dilemma when one of their friends dabbles with drugs or violence or sex or gambling or alcohol. And a good friend of that person must answer these two questions. Do you risk losing their friendship by confronting them, by addressing their problems? Or do you simply watch them destroy their life by standing back and not trying to help them? They're tough questions. And although we can never know for sure, but the growing youth gang crime, alcohol problems, drug issues that young people face, could these have been avoided had those who knew something been prepared to do something about it? So Paul reminds us here that love does not rejoice in the knowledge of evil or unrighteousness. It does not support evil or unrighteousness, but neither does it ignore sin and iniquity. Unfortunately, the reality often is this, that if you don't confront the person, you'll lose them anyway. And then Paul reminds us here to correct sin whenever possible. And brothers and sisters, the goal here is not to stand in condemnation over the person, but the end goal is restoration. The goal is not judgment, but compassion. Paul writes pastorally about this in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. He writes, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted." And Jesus himself, recorded for us by Matthew in chapter 18, verse 15, Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. And while we cannot force any person to change, we at least must be willing to help them. Several years ago, a magazine article told of a native South American tribe. And the members of this tribe were dying prematurely at too young an age. Some people went in to investigate, and they found that there was an insect that lived in the mud walls of this tribal people's homes. And this insect transmitted a deadly disease to those who lived within their walls. So the tribe was left with four options. They could relocate and move to a new area. They could destroy their homes, start from scratch, and rebuild their homes again. The third option was to treat the homes with insecticide, kill the insects. Or fourthly, they could do nothing. That would mean they would continue to die, they would continue to live short lives. After getting all the facts, surprisingly, the tribe decided to do nothing. While most people do desire some kind of help to get them through their difficulties and their problems, there are some who will reject the best attempts that people make to rescue them from their destructive behaviour. Love, however, must try, even though there are inherent risks. So love will face trials. Love must remain tough. And the third truth here that Paul writes is that love stands on the truth. After stating the negative, Paul tells us that we can share joy with those who are committed to the truth. And we do that by declaring the truth. There's a monologue drama entitled A Pot of Porridge. It's based on the biblical story of Esau's poor decision to trade his birthright for a pot of stew. And this drama is the story of a girl who tells her own personal and painful story of trading her virginity for a moment of sexual experimentation. With incredible grace and humility, this girl stands in front of a school class and challenges that room full of young people to guard their virginity. And in the telling and the challenge of her story, her concluding comment is this: you can become like me at any moment, but I can never be like you again. You can become like me at any moment, but I can never be like you again. Her testimony is both truthful and painful. Do you think that those young people in that class, listening to her, looked down on her or judged her? No. On the contrary, they admired her courage. They rejoiced that she had found peace in God's redemption. She'd experienced God's grace in her life. So what would motivate a young girl to share such a difficult chapter of her life? It was her love for God and her love for others, her love and concern for her peers, these young people. Declaring truth, even when it's difficult, honours God, and it leads, or its outcome leads to rejoicing. You remember the Old Testament story, and the people of Israel have left Egypt. They've wandered in the wilderness for many years. They've crossed over the Jordan and are conquering the promised land that God has given them. And they come to a town or a city called Ai. And God has told them that they will win the battle, they will defeat the people of Ai if they don't steal anything, take anything for themselves. They suffer a humiliating defeat. And Joshua and the Israelites have to confront a man by the name of Achan, for whom the temptation of stealing was much too strong. Achan steals cloth. He steals precious things. He hides them. And Achan is confronted for the sin of stealing that caused their loss. Joshua confronts him. And in Joshua chapter 7, verse 19, he exposes Achan's sin. And when the sin is confessed, the people are able to rejoice. Then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Confess your sin. Do not hide it from me." Achan's the man. He is discovered to have broken God's comment or order to not steal anything from the conquered enemies. And when found out, he's called upon to confess his guilt. And while his confession does not prevent the consequences of his sin, at least the relationship of the people of Israel is begun to be restored with God. Contrast this with the work of the devil. Jesus tells us that the devil does not hold to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Contrast this with the words of Jesus when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Which of course leads us to two very simple conclusions. If it's not true, it's not of God. And love must be built on truth. Love declares the truth, but love also demonstrates the truth. The English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote these words, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." Jesus might ask us the same, but with this twist. How do you love me? Show me the ways. After the crucifixion, it seems that Peter had destroyed his relationship with Jesus because of the way he had denied him. But in John chapter 21, after the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus meets Peter on a beach in Galilee. They eat breakfast together, and then Jesus confronts Peter. And he asks the fallen disciple, Peter, do you love me? Yes, I do love you, Lord. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. 3 times Jesus asks Peter if he loves him. And when Peter reaffirms his love for Jesus, Jesus tells him to show it by his actions. Love declares the truth, it demonstrates the truth, and love defends the truth. One of the most important questions that we need to consider is this: will we be men and women who will stand for what is right? And if we do so, will we apply this to our relationships? Or will we ignore or deny the truth about moral failure of those we love? Because this is when love must be both tough and true. Remember the words of Jesus? John chapter 8, verse 32, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson was a former counsel to United States President Nixon, but he was also the founder of Prison Fellowship. And he tells the story of a very unusual prison in Brazil that lacks armed guards and high-tech security. Humaita Prison has only 2 full-time staff. The rest of the work is done by the 730 inmates who are serving time for everything from murder and assault to robbery and drug-related crimes. Every inmate, when he arrives at the prison, is assigned another inmate to whom he is accountable. In addition, Every prisoner is assigned a volunteer mentor from outside who comes and works with him during his term until his release. Prisoners take classes on character development. They're encouraged to participate in educational and religious programs. And when an inmate enters the prison, his handcuffs are removed by the volunteer who says to him these words: "In this prison, your heart is handcuffed by love, and you are watched over by Christ." Coulson wrote, "When I visited this prison, I found the inmates smiling, particularly the murderer who held the keys, opened the gates, and let me in. Wherever I walked, I saw men at peace. I saw clean living areas. I saw people working industriously. The walls were decorated with motivational sayings and scripture. Humata has an astonishing record. Its reoffending rate is 4% compared to 75% in the rest of Brazil. How is that possible? I saw the answer when my inmate guide escorted me to the notorious cell once used for solitary punishment. Today, he told me, it always houses the same inmate. And as we reached the end of a long concrete corridor, he put the key into the lock. He paused for a moment and asked, "Are you sure you want to go in?" "Of course," I replied. "I've been in isolation cells all over the world." And slowly he swung open a massive door, and I saw the prisoner in that cell. A crucifix, beautifully carved, Jesus hanging on the cross. The prisoner in the solitary cell was Jesus. Upon his cross, a vivid reminder that he served the sentence for everybody in that prison, and he was still with them. My guide said to me softly, "He's doing time for the rest of us." Because of this knowledge of the suffering Christ among them, the offenders in Humata are daily reminded of the truth that many of us offenders who line our church pews every Sunday perhaps take for granted. That Jesus himself became a prisoner. He paid the price for your sin and my sin through execution on our behalf. And those inmates in that prison, poor and without privilege, may well live a life with a richer sense of God's grace than maybe I've ever felt in many an ornate church building. Brothers and sisters, does Christianity make a difference? If the grace and gratitude and the resulting changed lives that Coulson saw in Humata could well up in churches across the world, then skeptics would no longer have any questions to ask. To show Christian love involves humility, compassion, concern. But brothers and sisters, it also needs to take risks. It needs to be tough, and it needs to stand for truth. Amen.